Grade 11, Chapter 2, The Address. The chapter The Address is penned by Marga Menko. This short story is a poignant account of a daughter who goes in search of her mother's belongings after the war in Holland. When she finds them, the objects evoke memories of her early life. However, she decides to leave them all behind and resolves to move on. Why do you think the narrator does so? What makes her feel disheartened and disappointed? Let us read the story and find out what was the reaction of Mrs. Dorling when she saw the narrator after many years after the war. The woman looked at her searchingly when the narrator, Mrs. S. daughter, visited number 46 Merconi Street. Yes, this is the address that was given by the narrator's mother to the narrator when she was young. Mrs. Dorling looked at her searchingly when the narrator visits the place. The narrator came closer and stood on the step. Mrs. Dorling denied to recognize her. Mrs. Dorling said, "No, I don't know you." But the narrator continued, introducing herself. She said, "I am Mrs. S. daughter." But Mrs. Dorling held her hand on the door as though she wanted to prevent it opening any further. Her face gave absolutely no sign of recognition. She kept staring at the narrator in silence. The narrator stood at Mrs. Dorling's doorstep for quite a while. She pondered over how the things were, although she was helpless to make Mrs. Dorling know who she was and why was she there. Perhaps she was mistaken, she thought. Perhaps it wasn't her whom she had seen her only once fleetingly, and that was years ago. It was most probable that I had rung the wrong bell. The narrator was thinking about how she knew Mrs. Dorling. It had been a long time now, and she thought that she might have visited the wrong address. The woman let go of the door and stepped to the side. Mrs. Dorling did not allow the narrator to inside her house. A door opened and closed in the passage behind her. The narrator had to leave the place. But as she was moving back, as she turned, she could see that Mrs. Dorling was wearing her mother's knitted cardigan. The wooden buttons were rather pale from washing. She saw that she was looking at the cardigan and making sure that it was Mrs. Dorling whom she wanted to meet and ask about her mother's belongings. "Well, you knew my mother?" she asked. "Have you come back?" said the woman. "I thought that no one had come back." Mrs. S. daughter, the narrator, shared that she was the only one who had returned. Mrs. Dorling was really not expecting anyone to return after the war, but when she saw the narrator, she was highly surprised. Why was she not willing the narrator to meet her and know? She knew that if she would welcome narrator to her place, the narrator would not appreciate what she had done with her mother's belongings. And this is why she denied to recognize the narrator. "I regret I cannot do anything for you. I have come here specially on the train. I wanted to talk to you for a moment." This is how the conversation goes on. But Mrs. Dorling said, that it was not convenient for her to talk to the narrator at that moment. She said that she could not see her, so she should visit another time. The narrator nodded and left the place. She left from there. She noticed that the curtain in front of the bay window moved. Someone stared at her. The narrator looked at the nameplate again. Dorling it said in black letters on white enamel, and on the gem, a bit higher, the number 46. This is how the narrator cross checked whether she was at the right place to meet Mrs. Dorling. As she walked slowly back to the station, she thought about how her mother, who had given her the address years ago, was not very sure what Mrs. Dorling would do with her belongings. This was during the first half of the war. As a child, the narrator had been back home for a few days, and it struck to her immediately that something or other about the rooms had changed. So, as a child, when after being away from home for a long time, easily that there was something different at her place. She saw that various things in her house were missing. She told this to her mother, and her mother was surprised how she had noticed something that had changed so instantly and quickly. Then her mother told her about Mrs. Dorley. She had never heard of her, but apparently she was an old acquaintance of her mother, whom she hadn't seen for years. She had suddenly turned up and renewed their contact. So now, when the narrator is thinking about her past, she is trying to recollect how her mother had been, how she had introduced Mrs. Dorling to her. Since then, she had come regularly. So, after such a long time, when Mrs. Dorling had renewed her contact with the narrator's mother when the narrator was a child, then she visited the narrator's place regularly to collect her mother's belongings. So, if you read page number 11, in the third last paragraph, you read that every time she leaves here, she takes something with her. She took all the table silver in one go into plates that hung there. She had trouble lugging those large vases, and this is what made her worry. Why was the narrator worried? Crockery and other items that Mrs. Dorling was carrying along when she visited her place, she would not be able to save all those nice things. But as a child, she was helpless. She did not know what to do then. You agreed with her that she should keep everything, she asked her mother. As if that's necessary, her mother cried. It would simply be an insult to talk like that and think about the risk she is running each time she goes out of our door with a full suitcase or bag. This was the reaction of the narrator as a child when she saw how Mrs. Dorling used to carry huge bags and suitcases with her and carried all her mother's belongings whenever she happened to visit her home. The narrator had remembered the address. She knew that she would one day visit Marconi Street. I'd remembered it, she said, but I had waited a long time to go there. To go there. Initially, after the liberation, she was absolutely not interested in all this old stuff, and naturally, she was also rather afraid of it. Afraid of being confronted with things that had belonged to a connection that no longer exists, which were hidden out the cupboards and boxes and waiting in vain until they were put back in their place again. Here, the narrator seems to have thoughtful. She wanted all the belongings to be brought back and kept at the right place once again. Kept at the right place once again. But after the war, she thought that gradually everything had become normal again. Bread was getting to a lighter color. There was a bed you could sleep in, dancing at each. And one day she noticed she was curious about all the possessions that must still be at that address. She wanted to see them, touch them, and remember. So, as a child, what she lost years ago made her feel feel very unhappy. But after a long time, when things were normal after the war, she thought to visit the that her mother had given her when she was young. After her first visit in Wales to Mrs. Dorling's house, she decided to try a second time. Now a girl of about 15 opened the door to her. The narrator asked her if her mother was at home. No, she said, my mother's doing an errand. The narrator thought to wait there for a while so that she can Mrs. Dorling. But later on, the narrator followed the girl along the passage. She was surprised to see an old-fashioned iron Hanukkah candle holder hung next to a mirror. We never used it because it was more cumbersome than a single candlestick, she thought to herself. She knew that the candle holder was hers. It belonged to her. Won't you sit down? Asked the girl. She held open the door of the living room and the narrator passed her. The narrator stopped horrified. She was in a room she knew and did not know. She found herself in the midst of things she did not want to see again, but which oppressed her in the strange atmosphere. Why was she horrified? She was horrified because the things were not well kept. She did not know what she should do, but she scarcely dared to look around her. The girl moved a chair, asked her to wait for a while. The narrator sat down and stared at the woolen tablecloth. She rubbed it to check what it was. Her fingers grew warm from rubbing. She followed the lines of the pattern. Somewhere on the edge there should be a burn mark that had never been repaired. This is what she thought to herself. Mrs. Dorling's daughter stood there for a while and said, my mother will be back soon. Back soon. I have already made tea for her. Will you have a cup? She asked. The narrator looked up. The girl put cups ready on the tea table. Just that, the narrating else, Mrs. Dorling's daughter poured tea from a white pot. All it had was a gold border on the lid. The narrator noticed this. She knew that the utensils belonged to her. The girl opened a box and took some spoons out. That's a nice box. The narrator heard her own voice. It was a strange voice, as though each sound was different in that room. Oh, you know about them? Mrs. Darling's daughter was highly surprised to know about how the narrator knew about those utensils that she was using. My mother says it is antique. We have got loads more. She pointed around the room and said, see for yourself. Mrs. Darling's daughter was unaware about the fact that the antique items and the utensils that they were using belonged to the narrator's mother. I had no need to follow her hand, the narrator thought to herself. She knew which things she meant. She just looked at the still life over the tea table. As a child, she had always fancied the apple on the pewter plate, so the memories of the past uneasy.